This week on the APUSHow, we look at Chapter 25, The Global Crisis, 1921 to 1941. We'll look at the diplomacy of the new era. Was it anything like the diplomacy of the old era? Was it just as America first? Was it just as racist? Was it just as ineffective at stopping a world war? I guess we shall see. We'll look at isolationism and internationalism. Man, so many isms. I wonder which ism proved to be the dominant ism, isolationism or internationalism. Considering it's a global crisis and there's a world war coming after, I'm betting it's the latter. And lastly, we'll look at neutrality and intervention. Good thing we're not talking about neutrality, otherwise someone might get a little triggered. All this and more this week on the APUSHow. So before we launch into a riotously engaging lecture on the U.S. foreign policy and the buildup from the 1920s to World War II, the most horrific war the world has ever seen, we need to address our own acts of horrific violence that occurred right here on this show last week. Last week, I was violently and brutally attacked by my co-host William Howard Taft for no reason, and needless to say, some conflict resolution is sorely needed. Luckily, I've had some restorative justice training, so Taft and I agreed to sit down in a restorative peace circle where Taft shared his feelings as the horrible aggressor in this brutal attack, and I shared my own feelings as the blameless victim.
So I guess the attack made me feel confused, slightly nervous for a bit, and hurt on a physical and emotional level as to
feeling somewhat satisfied with our shared understanding of each other's feelings regarding this horrific incident, we agreed to put it in the past and take a nice, good old-fashioned restorative justice nap. Now, if only they had international restorative justice back in the 1930s, perhaps World War II could have been avoided, and maybe 75 million people did not have to die as a result. But we'll see how U.S. foreign policy played its own unique role in the build-up towards the horrific yet fascinating period we know as World War II. Many who have studied and subsequently criticized American foreign policy in the 1920s have essentially summed up the U.S. foreign policy in one word: isolationism. The idea that America, having given up on Wilsonian, the League of Nations, and international diplomacy, essentially turned its back on world affairs and just sort of let things devolve into a world war. However, we'll see that's not entirely accurate, as the United States in the 1920s was actually more active in foreign affairs than it ever had been in the entire nation's history up to that point, often to very volatile and unstable results for the rest of the world. One of the main issues of the United States approach was that the United States wanted all the benefits of world peace, but didn't want to do any of the work throughout the world to maintain said peace. By the start of the Warren Harding administration, the League of Nations appeared to no longer be an option for the United States. To try and replace this, Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes negotiated separate peace treaties with the former Central Powers of World War I. By doing this, Hughes hoped the United States would gain the privileges of the Treaty of Versailles without having to bear any of the responsibility of the treaty that might prevent the U.S. from doing what it wants throughout the world. And this all-benefit, no-responsibility approach to diplomacy would be seen again when the United States coordinated the Washington Conference of 1921, when Hughes arranged a meeting between the United States, Britain, and Japan, in which the three powers surprisingly agreed to reduce their naval presence throughout the world. The Kellogg-Briand Pact would further solidify the keep the peace with little to no effort approach, as the Secretary of State of the Calvin Coolidge administration, Frank Kellogg, proposed a treaty that stated, among other things, that war never be used as an instrument of international policy. 62 total nations would agree to this policy, but it contained no actual consequences or enforcement for the policies of the treaty. Instead, it only relied on, as Kellogg put it, the, quote, moral force, unquote, of world opinion to keep it in line. But unfortunately, as we know now, there were some powerful voices in the 1920s and 1930s that flat out rejected any notion of morality or world opinion. The United States in the 1920s focused most of their foreign policy in the same way that they focused their domestic policy, ensuring that American business had as few obstacles as possible. Most American foreign policy officials and experts agreed that the most important responsibility was to ensure that Americans were able to freely trade throughout the world with no impediments to trade, whether that be some sort of dangerous arms race or restrictive financial circumstance. Perhaps the greatest financial hurdle to climb was the issue of Europe's massive debt in the aftermath of World War I. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to pay a ton of money to England and France in reparations, and England and France had $11 billion in loans to pay back to the United States for our financial help during the war. This created a circular debt structure in which Germany had to be able to pay off its debt to France and England so they could in turn pay their debt to the United States. This was a problem because Germany struggled to pay their debts, mostly because of the sheer size of their debt, the massive damage caused by the war to their economy, as well as suffocating restrictions from the Treaty of Versailles. The United States refused to reduce or relax these loans, but instead offered another solution: offer more credit to Germany by offering them gigantic loans to pay back their war debts. This worked at first and even caused American businesses, especially automobile manufacturers, to create inroads in Europe, especially Germany. But what this did create was a circular loan structure which only further destabilized the extremely fragile European economy and created an over-reliance of the American economy on the European economy. High American tariffs didn't help either, as Europe really couldn't sell anything in the US, and therefore Europe had very few avenues of growth through trade as a result. Of course, we know now that the overextension of credit and an over-reliance on fragile and fraudulent economies would eventually lead to the global economic catastrophe we now call the Great Depression. A somewhat similar approach was taken in Latin America, as the United States would invest heavily in the region via large loans. But just like Europe, there are also huge tariffs which prevented Latin American countries from selling goods in the United States, which in turn made paying off said loans very difficult. That, along with the constant United States interference with Latin American politics and revolutions, there was a growing resentment for what would be known as Yankee imperialism. The United States approach of put everyone in debt to you but give them no means to pay back said debt would prove to be a disaster in the long run on numerous levels in the 1930s. Growing debts and increased instability would finally bubble over in the 1930s. The Great Depression would expose the massive cracks throughout the global economy created by incredibly unbalanced trade agreements created by the United States and its allies with the rest of the world. President Herbert Hoover attempted to create goodwill with Latin America by going on a 10-week tour of the region, but economic distress would cause various regimes to be toppled by revolutionaries and military coups. In order to curb this, Hoover would relax United States intervention in the region, even if a country failed to pay its debts to the United States. Europe's situation grew even more dire than Latin America, as countries decimated by the economy as well as post-World War I sanctions would resort to extreme nationalism and militarism. In countries like Italy and Germany, leaders like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler would lead political movements that aimed to give the, quote, true, unquote, citizens of their country a renewed sense of self-worth. They would cast blame for the country's woes on certain groups like Western nations and Jewish people. They would tell their people that only their political organization can save the nation, so therefore all other political organizations must be destroyed. And many Germans and Italians became swept up in these movements as years of frustration and disillusionment turned many people away from their ineffective governments towards groups like the Nazis, who gave people a simple yet diabolically false picture of the world, humanity, and the future. future. In Japan, a somewhat similar development was occurring as its own economic depression caused many people to question their own government and turn toward a more militaristic national vision. Instability in neighboring China brought that to a reality as a large civil war led to the Chinese takeover of Japanese-controlled lands in the northern Chinese region of Manchuria. In response to this, Japanese militarists would seize the government in 1931 and later that year launch a full-on invasion of Manchuria, effectively marking the beginning of World War II. The Chinese government, under the leadership of nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, would attempt to fight off the Japanese, but Japanese aggression, poor Chinese leadership, as well as a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists would cause China to fall to Japan. Also didn't help that the United States did nothing to stop the Japanese, as we had previously made treaties with Japan and were also selling them large amounts of oil. By the time Hoover left office in 1932, it was apparent that American foreign policy of half-hearted efforts at international cooperation, coupled with a lack of commitment to do anything to help the interests of other countries, was a failure. The United States now had a choice to either engage in nationalist projects to create a more self-reliant vision for the nation, or engage in more committed efforts to gain more meaningful international associations. And the United States would sort of do both. In the next section, we'll see how the newly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced the duality of challenges: fix the Great Depression or focus on the decaying international structure. Though these two things are not mutually exclusive, telling the American public that's in the middle of the worst economic depression of all time to turn away from their depression and think about international affairs would have been political suicide for FDR. However, as the 1930s rolled on, Americans realized more and more that they could not ignore the world events forever and that something would have to be done to ensure the safety of not only the United States, but perhaps for the rest of the world. Whereas Hoover aimed to maintain traditional currency standards, Roosevelt shifted away from the idea of maintaining the supremacy of the American dollar via the gold standard. Roosevelt felt that a gold-backed currency would only further cause American goods to be too expensive for overseas markets. FDR would unleash his, quote, bombshell, unquote, in 1933 when he rejected agreements on currency stabilization. He would then abandon the Hoover policy of war debts, as he would essentially let these debts die by forbidding banks from issuing loans to countries that had defaulted on previous debts. His goal was to stop the old circular system of indebtedness, and it worked, as almost all countries except for Finland stopped paying war debt payments. Taft, what do you think about the circular system? It's a little problematic, don't you think? FDR's indifference toward currency stabilization would not be extended to America's position in terms of world trade, as he sought to increase America's ability to conduct sound trade policies. He would approve the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, which sought to lower tariffs with certain countries to increase American exports. However, this act forbid the importation of most products that were competitive with pre-existing American products. As a result, foreign countries still suffered an imbalance of trade, which caused them to still not have enough money to buy things made in the United States. America became so desperate for a viable source of trade that many began to explore the possibility of trading with the Soviet Union. By 1932, the United States still refused to recognize the Soviet government as legitimate, but the need for a trading partner would change that. After a series of meetings between FDR and Soviet Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov, or Max Lit, as his friends should have called him, reached an agreement that the Soviets would cease spreading propaganda in the United States, and the United States would recognize the Soviet regime as the legitimate rulers of Russia. But efforts to establish trade in Russia would never take off, just as the United States failed to live up to their agreement to slow down Japanese aggression against Russian territories. By 1934, the United States and the Soviet Union still viewed each other with a great deal of mistrust. Despite failures in Europe and the Soviet Union, one relative degree of success was achieved in Latin America with the Good Neighbor policy. As mentioned earlier, Herbert Hoover greatly reduced American intervention into Latin America. Well, Roosevelt would take this further when the United States Secretary of State Cordell Hull would announce at the Inter-American Conference in Montevideo, Uruguay in 1933 that, quote, no state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another, unquote. FDR would honor this throughout his presidency, as he would refrain from using military intervention in Latin America. But the United States did not abandon Latin American intervention, as it increased its use of economic interventions. However, the discontinuation of military intervention did dramatically improve United States and Latin American relations. The Roosevelt administration would not only witness the undoing of Hoover's currency policy, but many of the hopes of peace through diplomacy would die out as well. As diplomacy failed, more and more Americans would embrace the idea of isolationism as a means of keeping the United States out of yet another European conflict. Many Americans embraced isolationism, as the Wilsonian efforts at international order pretty much all failed. Also, a lot of populist politicians began to perpetuate the idea that American bankers and arms manufacturers pressured Wilson to join World War I in order to make more money. Though there wasn't a whole lot of evidence to support this theory, it made a lot of sense to a lot of Americans, including President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Isolationist attitudes would eventually lead to the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37, as the United States pledged to sell no arms to anyone involved in a military conflict, and that Americans could travel on ships of warring nations only at their own risk. However, the neutral isolationist policy of the United States would be put to the test with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Italian leader Benito Mussolini sought to increase Italy's colonial presence by invading and conquering the North African country of Ethiopia, which it did in 1935. Italy would also formally align itself with Germany, thus creating the Axis powers. In Spain, a fascist government would rise up and threaten to take over the country. Again, the United States would not involve itself directly, but Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy would support the Spanish fascists, also known as the Falangistas. Or if you're a gringo imperialist, you might say phalangist. Me duele en mi mano. A few Americans would independently give direct support to the Spanish Republican government, but the United States and the United Kingdom and France would give no direct support. Americans were deeply committed to isolationism, and this was readily apparent after Roosevelt's quarantine speech in 1937. FDR was alarmed by developments in China as the Japanese government continued its all-out conquest of China. He would warn in a speech in Chicago of what could happen if belligerent nations were not, quote, quarantined, unquote, by the international community to prevent the scourge of war from infecting the world. His speech drew quick and disturbing condemnation from the American public, and FDR would step back from publicly confronting Nazis, fascists, or imperialists. In the late 1930s, developments in Europe would continue to worsen and push the continent further to war, but one glimmer of hope emerged in 1938 at the Munich Conference. Earlier that year, German forces would take over Austria and Czechoslovakia with little to no resistance from the rest of Europe, as the continent was still terrified of the prospect of yet another war. To try and deal with this diplomatically, leaders from England, France, and Germany would meet in Munich to try and talk things out. The talks seemed promising, as Hitler would agree to take no further lands as long as England and France agreed to not provide any interference to his already conquered territories. But this policy known as appeasement now became synonymous with failure, as Hitler ignored all elements of the agreement. Making matters worse, the Soviet Union, who was left out of the Munich Conference, signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. No meaningful power stood in the way of Nazi Germany, as it staged a fake Polish attack at the German-Polish border and subsequently launched a full-on attack on Poland afterwards. World War II in Europe had begun. Which brings us to our last section on neutrality and intervention, as we see the United States try to remain neutral in terms of its actions, but recognized it was impossible to remain neutral in terms of the collective consciousness of the nation. However, to what degree the United States would involve itself in the war proved to be mostly non-committal, as the United States would support the actions of France, England, and the Allies, but refused to involve itself directly. That is until this little thing in Hawaii happened. As the war began to escalate in Europe, Roosevelt would ask Congress to revise its neutrality acts as they pertained to the sale of ammunition. Roosevelt wanted the same cash and carry policy that was used for non-war related materials to be extended to war-related materials. Cash and carry was a policy that in order for a nation involved in war to buy things from the United States, they had to pay for it with cash and had to transport it themselves. This was to avoid some of the economic and political issues that occurred when the United States tried to sneakily sell arms on credit to England and France in World War I. His request would be granted, but isolationist influences in Congress ensured that the arms would be purchased via the same cash and carry policy. In the early days of the war in Europe, things moved relatively slowly after the invasion of Poland. In fact, many Americans began to call it a, quote, phony war, unquote, as the only fighting occurred in and around Russia as the Soviet Union would take over the Baltic states and Finland. But notions of the war being phony would soon prove to be objectively false, as the Nazis would overrun Western Europe and France with their so-called lightning war strategy, which sounds way scarier when you use the German name, the Blitzkrieg. As the Nazis marched through Paris, the world anxiously watched as only the battered English army stood in the way of German control of Western Europe. FDR would try and offer what aid he legally could as he traded about 50 warships to England in exchange for the right to build bases in English territory. Though the giving of aid to England may have been a politically precarious move before, the conquest of France would shift public opinion more and more towards intervention. Based on polling figures at the time, the majority of Americans began to believe that Germany posed a direct threat to the United States of America. However, to what degree the United States would get involved was still somewhat up in the air. Many Americans agreed that the Germans were still an ocean away, so direct intervention may have been unnecessary. Apparently none of them watched that scary Amazon Prime show, The Man in the High Castle. Well, to be fair, Taft, every show puts you to sleep. Including this one, yes. One group that advocated for immediate declaration of war was the Fight for Freedom Committee. However, they had pretty fierce opposition in the powerful lobby called the America First Committee. This was a group of powerful and influential Americans who advocated for isolation and further neutrality. They would find support from well-known names like Charles Lindbergh, General Hugh Johnson, Senator Gerald Nye, as well as many newspapers throughout the country. They would also find a lot of support from various fringe white supremacist groups, as well as Nazi organizations that existed in the United States at the time. The debate between interventionists would be loud, bitter, and very complicated in the build-up to the election of 1940. As the 1940 presidential election began to unfold, many Americans wondered if FDR would run for an unprecedented third term. Considering that FDR would not publicly commit to either running or stepping down, no other Democrats really had time to establish themselves. FDR would then say he would accept a, quote, draft, unquote, from his party, perhaps making a reference to the Burke-Wadsworth Act, which enacted the first peacetime military draft the country had ever seen. Because of FDR's massive coalition of voters, as well as his refusal to commit to either isolation or intervention, no Republican could seriously challenge him in terms of popularity or policy. The Republicans would nominate the somewhat unorthodox candidate and politically experienced businessman, Wendell Willkie. In the end, he was no match for FDR, who won decisively in 1940. With the election behind him, FDR was less encumbered in terms of his maneuvers regarding the war. He would then authorize a Lend-Lease program, which allowed the United States to essentially loan arms shipments to the United Kingdom, as the UK was essentially broke by 1940. This would, of course, aggravate isolationists, but what would further push the United States towards war was the sinking of American ships by German submarines or U-boats. The sinking of the Reuben James in particular enraged many Americans, as the incident resulted in the death of many American sailors. However, the American Lend-Lease program would be extended to the Soviet Union after the Germans broke their non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union in the fall of 1941. In a somewhat unusual alliance, the United States would agree to aid the Soviet Union, but only in terms of a supplier, not as a fellow combatant. Yet. With attention focused heavily on Europe, Japan continued to make moves to increase its dominance over the Pacific. Having effectively conquered China, Japan would make moves on Indochina, which is essentially present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. They would also sign the Tripartite Pact, which essentially was a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy. The Axis powers of World War II would effectively be set. Outraged, FDR would establish a complete trade embargo with Japan, which would cause a significant shift in Japanese war policy as Japan acquired most of its oil from the United States. Racistly enough, though, few Americans objected to these belligerent actions as racist hostility towards the Japanese was still very strong in 1941. In a last-ditch effort to arrange for peace, Japanese diplomats under the command of newly appointed military leader Hideki Tojo would present terms for peace with the United States. But peace would not be achieved as neither side refused to budge on their stance regarding the Japanese takeover of China. An attack proved to be inevitable as American intelligence determined the Japanese attack would occur within days, but where the attack would occur was still unknown. Americans did not suspect the Hawaiian base of Pearl Harbor would be attacked, as it was considerably far from any Japanese naval movement or installment at that time. Because of that, the island base was completely left unguarded and open to attack. The attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 proved to be disastrous, as 7 naval vessels, 188 aircraft, several buildings, and over 2,000 sailors would be lost. The next day, Roosevelt would issue his famous Pearl Harbor speech, and Congress would declare war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy would declare war on the United States. The United States would declare war on the very same day. World War II had begun. And to think all of this could have been avoided with some serious commitment to restorative justice. Right, Taft? I appreciate your honesty, and I appreciate all of you tuning in this week. Don't forget to tune in next week when we talk about the United States in World War II and how the United States would manage a war on 3 fronts. A war on the European front, a war on the Pacific front, and a war on the home front. As always, on behalf of William Howard Taft and myself, thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget, we gotta keep pushing, G.